I will leave that alone. So they can hear me?
Say something else?
Hello.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
You want to ask them to raise their hand if they can hear you?
Can you raise your hand to see if you can hear me?
Tell
We're going to
them
be
how to.
beginning
She has
shortly.
to tell them how to raise their hand.
And to raise your hand, what you do is you go to participants, and in the participants page where you'll be able to um, see all the participants, at least their names. At the bottom, you'll see how to raise hand, and that's where you'll be able to raise your hand. Just okay, great. You can hear me. Yeah, we'll be beginning shortly.
Well, we'll have a record of everyone. Jenny, you can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I think it's fine to begin whenever you want. Go for it.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Um, Today is, well, first, my name is Jenny Burns. Glad everybody is here. Today is May 5th, 2020. This is the Dutchess County Committee of Correspondence meeting. And today we will be gathered together with Diane Sayre, candidate for U.S. Senate of New York, Jason Ross, LaRouche Science Team, from the LaRouche Science Team, and Bob Baker from the EI. Um, and without any further ado, Diane?
Sure. I'll go ahead. I presume that everybody can hear me. And if you're watching on Zoom, make sure you select in the corner. You don't want gallery view, which means you see everyone equally, but you want to see the speaker the largest because I'll be showing some graphics and things like that. So some of you may be wondering why a candidate for U.S. Senate is wearing a little hat with a Soviet hammer and sickle on it today. And that also has to do with this ribbon here on my jacket, which is a St. George's ribbon. The reason that I'm wearing these things, and I have brought this flag, which was from my father-in-law, who was in the U.S. Navy in the Korean War, is that this weekend, May 8th and May 9th, it's the 75th anniversary of VE Day. It's the 75th anniversary of the defeat of Adolf Hitler. Now, I hope that people listening to this program are with me in believing that the defeat of Hitler and the victory in World War II was a big deal. That this was really the last war that was unavoidable for us by any means, and it was necessary to defeat fascism in Europe and in Asia. And you may notice that there are hardly, I don't even know of any celebrations going on about this incredible victory, and the fact that the victory was won. The Allied powers that FDR was working with were the US, the UK, Russia, and China. So think about that. How is it now suddenly that we are told that Russia and China are the biggest adversaries of the United States when 75 years ago we united to defeat a fascist menace that killed tens of millions of people, including over 6 million Jews or more in Europe. And somehow we're not supposed to discuss this. And furthermore, that this anniversary, the 75-year anniversary of the victory against fascism in Europe, is probably the last major anniversary for anyone alive who fought in that war. I hope there are people watching this program tonight who are honored enough to have family members or loved ones or, your relatives who fought in that war. And you think about the quality of the people of the World War II generation. They were quite extraordinary. World War II generation, if you think about them, they rarely complained about anything. Lyndon LaRouche was a veteran of World War II. He was stationed in Asia, in Burma, and then in India. And his work there really shaped his existence. This ribbon I'm wearing is the symbol, the Russian symbol of the fight against fascism. And the Russians lost 27 million people in that war. This is a very personal matter for Vladimir Putin, and you may or may not be aware that Presidents Trump and Putin signed a joint proclamation on April 25th, because that was the 75th anniversary of the famous meeting at the River Elbe, where we were nearing the end of the war. And when the Soviet and the American forces met at the river, it meant they had broken the German supply line in half. It meant that they knew that victory would be assured. And you can imagine the absolute joy after the horrors that people had been in the combat of the Soviet and American soldiers greeting each other and knowing that they had finally broken the lines of the German enemy. So Trump and Putin issued a joint proclamation saying that this victory demonstrated that there were matters of principle which our nations can collaborate on. Now, what you also probably don't know is that Franklin Roosevelt was in a huge brawl with Winston Churchill over the matter of the British, Dutch, and French colonies. That FDR said to him, "We are defeating a fascist horror that is grinding up people in concentration camps, and we are doing this not just for the cause of freedom in Europe, but for the cause of freedom in the world. And your 18th century methods are not all that different. If people know what the British did in India or Sierra Leone, or what the Dutch or the Belgians did in the Congo, for example, or what the Dutch did in their sugar plantations in the Caribbean. I mean, absolutely hideous crime." So FDR said to Churchill, at the end of this war, every single nation should be given its independence and sovereignty. And we should have an economic policy that allows each nation to have its sovereignty, and Churchill got red in the face and said, "Well, what do you mean 18th century methods?" And FDR said, "Any policy which takes the raw materials and labor out of a country and gives it nothing in return." So it was LaRouche's view that the British came up with various tactics to delay the war to make sure that FDR was dead by the end of it. As people may know, various of the American generals thought we should cross over into Normandy, into France. We should attack Germany that way much earlier than we did, across the English Channel. Instead, we spent a great deal of time and energy in northern Africa and Italy. And FDR finally died on April 12th, 1945. The meeting at the Elba was about 2 weeks later, April 25th, 1945. VE Day was not until May 8th, 1945. So this is an outrage. It is an outrage that the United States is trying to forget the history of which should be a great honor that we participated in something noble for the good of mankind. And our post-war policy, unfortunately, FDR was dead, so we did not transform the world. But if you look at the Marshall Plan, if you look at what General MacArthur did in Japan, the policies of our nation led to stability and prosperity for many decades to follow, and Americans should be given the opportunity to be proud of this, as opposed to the British-run witch hunt being levied now against President Trump and against any possible collaboration with these nations. Now, I want to take a minute and look at a video of Mr. LaRouche speaking, and then I have one other short thing to say about our relationship with China, and then we'll be joined by our other speakers. So if we could have the video.
So what do you live for? Do you live like an animal to go out with a whimper? Or do you live like a human being, knowing that you are doing something, you are developing in yourself, something which will be transmitted to future generations to make humanity better in the future? You no longer are a little person living in a little neighborhood with a little mind, with little ambitions and little interests. You suddenly become a very big person because you have the minds of some of the greatest people in history before you live in you, and your replication of what exactly their act of discovery. You do things with pride to say, he was right. This was a great discovery. We've got to use it for mankind's benefit. You say, I've got to do something to make the future better for those who come after us. And I can die with a smile on my face, because I've lived well. I've lived at peace with the greatest people of the past, or at least some of them. And I can live at peace with joy in the people of the future. I will live forever in this process. That's what it is to be human. And when you think like that, and look at other people like that, you don't have a problem. You may have problems, but that's fun. Because if problems force you to attack and solve problems, whether as an individual or in conflict with others, that is fun. It's what the puppy does when the happy puppy is playing. The worst thing you can do to a puppy is not play with it. Make it angry. It gets bored. The worst thing you do to a horse is not play with it, not work with it. It gets bored. It's unhappy. May get sick and die on you. It has no purpose in life. Human beings have a different kind of play. It's that kind of play called cognition in respect of past and present, which makes an absolute moral difference, which defines the individual person as a creature made in the image of the Creator. When you think in those terms, then you think accordingly. Now, how do we get out of this mess? I've defined implicitly what the problem is. The problem is we are gripped by a system, a doomed system, a self-doomed system. This system, this financial monetary system, with its legal trappings such as Scalia, with its popular trappings such as popular opinion, this system, with its lack of sense of what humanity is, a lack of moral principle. There is no moral principle. If you don't have a sense of what humanity is, as I've described it, you have no morality. It's all mechanical. There's no morality in it. Morality involves passion. And passion, moral passion, is love for human beings. It's love for those who created people who went before you. It's love for those who are coming afterward. To do nothing shameful in the eyes of those who came before you, even if you disagree with them. And to do nothing which is not beneficial to the society that comes afterward. No, in Plato called this agape. The Apostle Paul referred to this repeatedly, as in 1 Corinthians 13, as agape. Don't get involved like crazy Pat Robertson or Jerry Fall with these do's and don'ts, single issues. Forget the single issues. Don't marry about a list of do's and don'ts. Paul says the same thing. This is fraud. Concentrate on agape, which is the essence of all morality. And when you have agape, you don't need any other code except good judgment. Agape essentially is knowing what a human being is, knowing what humanity is, knowing what cognition is, and loving what you have received as benefits from the past, cognitively, and loving the future by giving to the future that which the future as human needs. And if you always act according to that, you may fall short in your understanding of what you need to do, but your intentions are always clear and moral. And that's what we lack essentially. So that's the problem I face. I live in a society in which my generation was degenerate, became my degeneration. And my degeneration taught their children to degenerate still further. And now the thing is collapsing. And people are saying, "How you got to fix the system. You can't change the system. You got to fix it. Don't talk about changing the system. Why don't you come up with some suggestion that will make the system work?" It's like, find a way to make strychnine enjoyable. That's the problem. What comes down to, we have a shortage of leaders. And this problem of leadership has two aspects to it. One aspect is people who are qualified to be leaders. What's a person qualified to be a leader? A person who is essentially, for what I've said here, a person of agape. A person who has passion, who has love for humanity, who wants to do good for future humanity, to honor the noble contributions of people from the past, and to give something better to the future. Those people are leaders. People who will not sell out the principle of agape for the sake of opinion or personal advantage. Will be not self-sacrificing.
So that was a speech from the late Lyndon LaRouche, who passed away about a year ago on Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And what he was addressing is the collapse that we are now in, and a collapse which President Trump, in concert with Putin of Russia, Xi Jinping of China, Modi of India, and other leaders who wish to join, absolutely are in a position to reverse. And it is that potential which brought on this witch hunt. We had an opportunity at the end of World War II, which was thwarted by the death of FDR, to actually crush the British liberal imperialist system. And instead, their view, which is free trade, their policy, which was to manipulate things so that Nixon ended up taking the dollar off the gold reserve system and bringing down the Bretton Woods system, so that now what we have is a bubble of derivative speculation, which has literally been sucking the blood out of the productive economy. If you want to imagine a 300-pound tick on a chihuahua, that's what we've been feeding. And even these stimulus packages, $2 trillion went to the first phase one of this, the CARES Act, American people, small businesses, etc. $4 trillion was issued by the Federal Reserve to bail out Wall Street. If you continue this, we are going to have hyperinflation, and the money that you're getting is going to be worthless. And this was not caused by COVID. This was caused by 60 years of so-called post-industrial economy. Why is it that the United States had only 2.3 hospital beds per 1,000 people when the crisis hit, whereas China started with 4.3 beds per 1,000 people? Why is it that the United States is suffering? You will hear from Bob Baker, a farm leader, organizer, who also, by the way, is a veteran. I just learned today, at any rate, about what's happened to our food supply. Why are we in this precarious situation where one crisis puts us over the cliff to disaster, and how do you reduce it? So that's what our speakers are going to get at. But before we get to that, I just want to say one other thing, which is this question of China. Because contrary to the propaganda, China did not engage in a massive cover-up and try to export the virus all over the planet. China did, there was an attempt to suppress the original physicians who warned about the virus, who discovered it in the early weeks, but by the 7th of January, China had released the genome to the world to begin developing a vaccine, and on January 23rd, they went into lockdown, and that was not a secret either. Now, there's been an article promoted all over the place, and unfortunately, this fraud found itself in one of Donald Trump's speeches. If you can show the slide of Niall Ferguson. This character, British, of course, was at Harvard University, then at Stanford, and you can see him here speaking at the Chatham House, which is a British institution where Henry Kissinger famously said that whenever he got really important intelligence, he gave it to the British before he gave it to the United States. Well, Niall Ferguson claimed that he had the flight records and that while China had done an internal lockdown after January 23rd, they were still flying flights out of Wuhan, the infected area, the center point of the coronavirus, to the rest of the world. Well, the truth of the matter, next slide, is that a researcher, Daniel Bell, a Canadian who's also in China, and you see his article, Did the Chinese Government Deliberately Export COVID-19 to the Rest of the World? He contacted Ferguson and said, well, this really would be very damning if this were true. What's your evidence? So Ferguson sent him his evidence, the flight records, supposedly. So Daniel Bell went and looked at the flight records, and sure enough, there were plenty of flights that were scheduled to go through Wuhan and leave from Wuhan on January 23rd, and they were all canceled. And there were no flights out of Wuhan from January 23rd on. And that is the official international flight records. So here you have, again, you can go back to, you have the British caught in a lie designed to pit the United States against China, pit the United States against Russia. Remember Russiagate? That wasn't so long ago. There wasn't one shred of evidence. You remember what they said? We are highly confident, and as various of the whistleblowers told us, whenever you hear anyone from the NSA or FBI or whatever, DOJ, say, we have high confidence, it means they don't have a shred of evidence. Because if they had evidence, they would prove it. So we had nothing about Russia. Well, we have high confidence that China somehow was spreading this virus. There is no evidence to that effect whatsoever. However, if the United States and China were to collaborate on addressing the needs of countries in Africa and South America and Asia, where you have potentially tens of millions of people who might die because of this, because they don't have running water, they can't shelter in place, they're living in a tin hut with no food, no refrigeration, no water. What is going to happen to these people? And then even if you are immoral and you don't care what happens to millions of people in the third world or in the developing sector, what happens if that virus is allowed to just generate and become very, very densely? Will it mutate? Will it come back even worse in the fall? So the universe has been created in such a way that mankind cannot ignore the fate of other human beings. We are our brother's keeper. That doesn't mean we don't have sovereignty. That doesn't mean there's not a place for sovereign nations, but you cannot violate natural law and expect to survive. And the issue, which we should remember on this VE Day, is that the enemy of the United States has been our ages-old enemy since the American Revolution. It's the British Empire, it's the British imperial way of thinking, it's their free trade policies, etc. And I think that's what I have to say, and I would like to now, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Jason Ross, who will be speaking about this question of health, Bob Baker, sorry. Actually, I wanted Bob to go first. So Bob, the food crisis, and then Jason will present the solution. And forgive me, Jenny, you should do the moderating because I don't know what I'm talking about. But why don't we hear from Bob Baker first and then Jason Ross.
Okay, that sounds great. Thanks a lot, Diane. And thanks for having me on this event. It's a very serious moment in the food crisis, and I want to go through some things that a lot of people don't realize. If you were, I had the graphics that are very useful, you would see a very, very sad and dangerous situation that's developing with the U.S. food supply because of the financial policy that has been perpetrated since Nixon took us off the Bretton Woods system and opened the door for speculation. This process has turned the whole nation, and in particular, I'm going to focus on agriculture and food, into a giant speculative binge that is really putting the food supply in jeopardy. Now, right now, people have seen various things happen in their food stores, in the grocery stores, and a lot of times in most grocery stores, you'll see a shortage of hamburger. You see a lot of empty shelves, and what's happened is we have consolidated more and more over the last 3 and 4 decades the various institutions of agriculture, so that right now we have these mega grocery stores, fertilizer companies, seed companies, livestock companies, and even the farmers have been consolidated into larger and larger units. And I'll give you an example of that. If you ask yourself, how many farmers are in the nation, in the United States? And you might scratch your head and say, well, geez, I don't know. But we have 2.1 million farmers. Now, out of that 2.1 million farmers, you have 4.5% that produce about 50% of the food. Now think about that. 4.5% of U.S. farmers produce 50% of the food. Now, out of that 2.1 million U.S. farmers, 80% produce 25% of the food. We have 50% of our farmers produce 1% of our food. So when you start calculating this, you find things like 15% of the farmers in the United States are producing 75% of the pork, beef, corn, soybeans, vegetables, etc., that this nation depends on. Now, that's pretty serious. But what you just have had happen because of this consolidation, where with the state, with very beautiful technology, by the way, And you've got to respect the producers and the fact that they have assimilated the space age technology in a way that nobody could have ever dreamed possible 30 years ago. But now it's coming to a point where you've got the physical economy is coming like this. It's like the financial system of speculation and the physical economy have both went like this. And guess what happened? The physical economy reacted because of all the debt, all the trillions of dollars that were needed to keep the speculators in business, except the consolidation of the production into fewer and fewer and fewer entities has now made our nation vulnerable to a food crisis. So here's some examples. We have 44 hog producers producing 66% of the food. Think about that. 44 entities produce 66% of the pork. I meant to say pork. Now that's not very many entities. But what they've restructured into is not millions and hundreds of thousands of individual farmers. There's lots of people working for these outfits, and they've got relationships with some farmers on the land. But even with all that, they're losing money. They're losing $37.50 per head per hog in the pork business right now. And on the other side, the meat packers that are monopolies that have ripped off people beyond belief, they're selling that meat to the grocery store, and between the meat packer and the retail chains, they're just gouging the people like nobody's business in the meat grocery stores. Now, if you look at beef, we've had farmers now are losing unprecedented amounts of money raising beef. You know, you don't raise beef like in 6 months like you do pig, but you raise it maybe in 11 months or maybe 12, sometimes a little bit less. But when the farmer goes to sell that right now, the rancher, after that cow gets big enough to sell, he's losing money. He's not getting back the amount he invested in putting that animal for the cost of buying it and feeding it grain. But the packing houses and the retail chains through the grocery stores, they're making the most unbelievable profits that have ever happened in history in the area of $1,300 to $1,600 per head. They're making. The producers are losing money, and they're making that when they used to make maybe $300 or $400 a head, but the producer would make maybe $150 a head or more. So you see, now we're putting that in a context that even without the virus hitting the meatpacking workers, we would see agriculture and food production in big trouble, because you can't produce food if you're going to lose money. And the crop farmers are the same way. The soybean farms, the corn farms, the cost of production is more than what they're getting paid. So you can't continue like that. Now, you put that in perspective with the virus hits, and what happens? Bang! All of a sudden, we see all the weak links. There's no resiliency. There's no extra supplies. There's no extra refrigeration warehouses like we used to have. There's no backup. And even the skill of the labor force, like for instance in the packing plants, I mean, these guys work hard and they're highly skilled to do the kind of work they're doing. You couldn't just bring somebody in, even if we didn't have a disease, to do that. So the thing that is important to realize, the United States right now is in the biggest food crisis in the history of our nation. And now, that's the United States. And how's come? Because we got a financial policy that's allowed cartels, meaning clusters of big food companies, to get bigger and bigger and to monopolize a pricing system with the idea that if you get bigger and you use lots of technology, you can get really efficient. So efficient that you don't hardly need anybody to work and produce the food or maintain the system. But the problem is, if you have a crisis like we do now, you don't have resiliency. Where if we was back to the orientation that the nation was founded on, the idea we're going to have millions of family farms, we're going to have thousands and thousands of butcher shops and packing plants like we used to. I mean, back in the 1980s, we had close to 10,000 packing plants in the United States. And now we have about 280, and about 70 of those slaughter about 90% of all the animals. So, and they're owned by about 4 outfits. 4 outfits. And unfortunately, 3 of those are from other foreign countries, like Brazil. So how did that happen? Well, if you look behind the scenes and pull the curtain back, then you're going to see the long arms of the old British monetary system, the old families, and a whole network of offshore tax and bank havens that all these big companies work through. And you see, that's the thing that nobody realizes. It's like the food system it's like there's an invisible network out there. Nobody even sees it. But if you go through any grocery store and you pick up your average products and you look up who they're owned by, and you'll find they're probably 85% are owned by about 6 companies. They might all have all different labels and boxes and pictures on the boxes, but it's very few people or big outfits, all monopolies, and these have to go. So this is where the idea of getting back to a family farm, the idea we're going to have to set up a pricing structure because the citizens in the city, as they realize now, are totally vulnerable without a solid food supply. And you can't have that if you don't have farmers making enough to pay their bills and keep their farms going and raise another generation to do the same thing. So we need to, instead of having 2.1 million farmers and having about half of them really not produce that much, we need to have them all producing a lot more, and we need to have about 1 million more farmers. Now, people would say, well, if we do that, how can we do that? Well, we're going to have the farmers more. But if we bust up the monopolies, you'll also find the farmers will get paid more and the food will go down in the grocery store. And that is a very significant thing now as we're going into this financial crisis. So I want to sort of put that out there as a concept to think about. It's serious, and the coronavirus has just shook everything to the foundation stones on the food system in our nation. And when you put the financial blowout that happened on Wall Street, if we need LaRouche's emergency policies, we need a Glass-Steagall credit system, get a national bank to direct that credit, and we're going to put in a parity pricing system so that all the farmers and the labor people get a living wage that's proper, and we're not going to let a bunch of cartels and monopolies treat the citizens like in a more animal way, because we're human beings. And this is what, like, Diane and her campaign is really focused on, and the best ideas that LaRouche, brought forward about developing humanity as a human being, and focus on that kind of environment with family farms, the communities, and the idea that people used to have when they could work as a community for the mutual benefit of everybody. So I'd like to just thank everybody, or thank you, Diane, for this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the next we have Jason Ross from the LaRouche PAC Science Team.
Hey, thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Bob. And thanks to everybody joining. Glad to be able to talk to you tonight. So we have a really enormous crisis on our hands. We have a pandemic virus that's very contagious. It's deadly to a scary number of people. There is no certain cure for it at this point. We have drugs that can be helpful for some people, but it's, we don't have an antiviral that, we can say, hey, you take this, you won't have any problems with it. Or you're a nurse, take this drug, you'll never catch it. We don't have that right now. And the kinds of measures that are being taken, these kind of blunt measures that we're taking to control the spread of this pandemic, think about what those look like in the third world. So, if you've seen the footage of the overloaded hospitals in New York City, or the overflowing hospitals in Italy, and you try to imagine what will it be like to take care of people contracting this virus in a country where most people don't have electricity, where there may only be a few ventilators for the entire country. Central African Republic has 3 ventilators, 5 million people. So how do you address this kind of challenge? As a matter of fact, what other problems like this are we susceptible to in a world where 1.7 billion people lack access to clean water and sanitation? Sanitation meaning, waste treatment, toilets and sewer systems and the like. A world where 800,000 children under the age of 5 die every year from diarrhea. 88% of cases could be eliminated, wouldn't happen if we had proper sanitation. So how are you supposed to wash your hands when you have no running water? How are you you spritz some Purell on your hand when there just isn't any? And what does it mean for you if you live day to day, hand to mouth, if you're told that you can't go to work for a period of time, that for a month you're going to have to stay at home, whatever home means, with however many people that might be that you live with at your home? Considering that of the 3.3 billion people in the world's labor force, 2 billion work in the informal economy. This means under the table, untaxed. It means no contracts. It means no pension. It means no retirement. Probably means no sick leave. Certainly no sick pay. It means no social safety net that you're part of through your workplace, like healthcare here in the United States, for example. Of those 2 billion, 1.6 billion, according to the International Labor Organization, are having their livelihoods threatened right now, both by the virus and by the measures that have to be taken because we don't have the ability to do better yet. So let's talk about what we should be doing on this. We've got washing our hands, wearing masks. These are great things to do. Staying distant from people, no, don't hug people that you don't live with, that kind of thing. Fine. Those are good ideas. But what we would really need to be able to get this thing under control, to bring the cases down, and then to be able to end the blanket closures of everything, which are very costly. And I'll tell you how if we had an ability to gear up testing incredibly rapidly, once we get to a level of 1 million tests per day, once we enlist an army of contact tracers, the estimates are it'll take 100,000 people. And these are people who will call you up if you got a positive test. They'll ask how you're doing. They'll check in on you. They'll say, who have you been, who did you see recently? Are there any coworkers that you had a meeting with where you spent, more than 15 minutes within a few feet of them, and all that? Then they'll call up all of those people. They'll help them get tested. They'll advise them what to do. In New York City, for example, doctors and other health providers can refer people who can't isolate at home. Let's say you live in an apartment with several people. How are you supposed to not get the rest of your family sick? Right. So New York City has a program where free hotel rooms paid for by the government are offered to people who need help having a way to isolate themselves. So that's another thing these contact tracers would do, help set all that up and everything. It's a lot of work. If we have that kind of capability, then we could have a much more targeted approach towards finding cases, actually tracing out each individual case. And if we get to a level where that's possible, like is happening pretty close in Germany at this point, they're doing a lot better recently, then we wouldn't have to have all these, these very, very tough measures, which are in many cases right now, unfortunately, being lifted, even while the number of cases continues to grow. We're on track right now to have 2,000 or 3,000 deaths per day in the United States. We're at about 2,000 right now. The number of cases is going up. So unless we find a cure very soon, we're going to see the number of deaths go up. So that would be, this could be looking at 1 million people dead. Here's what's going on, though, is that there are some really dangerous rumors that are being spread around. Diane brought up one of them, this lie that China essentially deliberately infected the world with the coronavirus by shutting down domestic travel, by keeping people from Wuhan out of Beijing. They said, you can't come to Beijing, stay in Wuhan. Yet, go to the international airport and fly anywhere else in the world. That didn't happen. That was a lie. Niall Ferguson, who told that lie, could have verified it. He didn't. He lied. Mike Pompeo has been going around saying that he's quite certain that the virus escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology or the Wuhan CDC lab. We don't know that. The point of saying things like this is, when you hear it from Mike Pompeo or very direct British mouthpiece Niall Ferguson, is to prevent cooperation between the U.S., Russia, and China. This is the most important issue right now. The U.S., Russia, China being able to work together along with India to set much better policies for the world. That's the most important thing in improving the situation. So this anti-China stuff threatens that, which we got to think about the entire world. That threatens the entire world. If we can't have collaboration between the greatest powers on this planet to work together to help address the huge health deficits and general infrastructure deficits, electricity, water, transportation of the less developed countries, where's our hope as a species? What will we do when the next virus jumps from, bats to pigs to people in 5 years if we don't build up our scientific knowledge and our abilities on that? So the other kind of goofy thing going on right now is that there's a lot of people who are saying the coronavirus is a hoax. It's just the flu. It's not deadly. Now, in our area, I think we've heard enough firsthand stories from New York City to know that that's not the case. But the impact of this kind of thing is to say, hey, it's really no big deal. Nothing really has to happen. We're fine. We're not fine. We really do need to gear up on this. And then a few things about making sure that it never happens again. We could develop a general, I'm not sure, but many top virologists say that it would be possible with enough funding, with enough research, to get a universal influenza vaccine. The current ones, you have to get them every year. They're only 50% effective. What if we could just, stop the flu altogether? What if we are able to develop systems where once you find a new virus, you can almost automatically create antivirals, antibodies that target it, maybe even a vaccine? Wouldn't that make sense? Wouldn't that be great? How about if we already develop and stockpile antivirals that work against the recent coronaviruses that we had already seen before this coronavirus came on the scene? If we already had that in large numbers, gosh, you wouldn't have to go to the hospital. You start to feel sick, you have COVID, great. Take the antivirals and, huge increase in health outcomes. So we can all be helpful that we're going to be getting good news about some of these potential treatments within the next few months. The vaccine's going to be a while longer. But the way we really have to think about this is, what are we going to do in the entire world? How are we going to take this chance to finally end the underdevelopment, the lack of progress that we've really had over the past 50 years? Imagine if the kind of growth and optimism that we had in the 60s, when Kennedy was taking us to the moon, when we were developing new technologies, new approaches, even new management systems to be able to make the whole thing work. And then all the amazing technologies that came out of the space program into all aspects of the economy. What if we never stopped? What if we kept going like that for the last 50 years? What would life be like today if we had 10 times more electricity in the world? If we had nuclear fusion rockets so you could go to Mars in a few days instead of 9 months like right now? If you had nuclear fusion rockets, so if an asteroid is coming towards the Earth, it's going to hit us, we could actually get out there and push it out of the way, give it a little nudge. Right now we can't. We could have been there if we had really moved in the past 50 years the way that Kennedy had sort of indicated, and the way that Lyndon LaRouche very actively and repeatedly proposed and put forward specific scientific advances like collaboration with the Soviet Union on the Strategic Defense Initiative, the huge importance of nuclear fusion with the magazine Fusion that LaRouche helped create, and which became a very actually widespread scientific magazine in the United States. So we got to think about where we are today, not in terms of, how are we compared to a couple months ago? Are we doing better or worse? It's not so great. The stock market's up and down. You got to think, we got to compare ourselves not to where we were last year, but compare ourselves to where we could have been if we had really done the right thing for the last 2 generations. And use whatever honest emotions come to you in that reflection to think about what we're going to be able to create, what we're going to choose to make happen for the next 2 generations. What will the world look like in 50 years? Are we still going to have, the Spanish flu, the coronavirus? Are we still going to have these things, assaulting us on a periodic basis? Or will we have done something about it? Will we have completely eliminated poverty on this planet? Something that we could do in a decade. Let's make that our mission. And let's say we're not just, dealing with this coronavirus pandemic, but hey, this reveals and makes very clear, especially when you look at the less developed countries, just how much we have failed to advance the way we should.
Okay.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so this starts the question period. So I'm going to go ahead and allow everybody to be able to unmute themselves so you can ask a question. So I'm going to take a moment to give you a chance to unmute and ask a question. Okay, so while people are coming up with the question, I do have some questions that have come in. The first one I'll go with is, how do you resolve the paradox or trap that more people may die from the collapse of the economy, the closures of the businesses, an economy which is shut down, than the people who will die from coronavirus?
Well, I think that we have to change what the parameters of this, shutdown are like. So, like I'm saying, like Diane brought up, back in January, China has isolated this new virus. It's published its genome to the international database. January 23rd, Wuhan is locked down, the province around it. It's kind of hard to miss that as a bit of a wake up call that, wow, this looks pretty bad. China is shutting down a city of over 10 million people. Wow. Unfortunately, we did not take the opportunity then to really gear up testing in a huge way. And you know what? It's hard to know exactly what's going to happen. That's why it's important to build up these capabilities in advance. There were plenty of public health people warning 5, 10 years ago, hey, we should really have a lot more of these PCR machines on hand. So when the next virus comes out, we'll be able to test people for it. It's not like this wasn't known. So gearing up the testing, and making sure that we have the ability to isolate people who are tested positive, like New York City is doing, like many other places around the country are increasingly doing, offering hotel rooms at government expense to people to get them away from their community so that they don't have to worry about infecting people, and then contact tracing. So if we get this to a point where someone's sick, we can actually figure out, okay, who else were they around? Let's make sure that we get all these people, quarantine them. But in general, things could be open. We wouldn't have to just close down, everything. But the way to make that happen isn't to decide between opening up and closing down right now. The way to make that happen is to say, are we going to use the Defense Production Act to get up to 1 million tests per day and more than that, so we can export tests to the world? I mean, in Africa, I think only Senegal and South Africa have the technologies to be able to produce, new test kits. Every country has them right now and is able to use them, but they're not made there, except for in those two countries. So that's how I would look at it. Yes, there definitely is a very real cost to the shutdown measures, and there's just so much that we don't know. We haven't had something like this really in over 100 years. I mean, in the Spanish flu, large public gatherings were banned, transportation was restricted. Some cities completely closed themselves off and said no one's allowed to come into the city while this flu is still spreading around. It was effective. I hope they didn't get too lonely, but it worked. Masks were required in various contexts around the Spanish flu. These are things that we did in the U.S. Over 100 years ago. So we're gonna learn more and more about what's most important, what's easy to do, versus what's very difficult. Wearing masks, very easy. Shutting down everything, very costly. So let's learn more about these measures, and most importantly, let's make sure that we can identify and trace out infections so that it's not just an unknown who is sick, let's keep everybody away from each other, but being able to really identify, oh, these people have it. Okay, let's keep them at home. We'll deliver groceries to them. They'll get over it. Okay, now they're not going to spread it anymore. We need to build up the ability. So that's the way to open.
I also want to add something on that question, which is, if you take the little bit that we've done so far, I shouldn't say little because it's been substantial, because we were, thanks to the 60 years post-industrial economy, a kind of a broken down rubble heap. You've heard of the Rust Belt, for example. So I know of at least 2 plants that were open to produce ventilators and PPE, which each hired 500 people. What Jason's talking about in terms of getting 100,000 people who are trained to do contact tracing. Also, we don't have quite the capacity we should to do that amount of testing. I know one of our supporters actually wrote a proposal here in New Jersey that students, science students, should be able to use the facilities at various universities to help perhaps process a lot more tests, that people who are working on a master's or doctorate in various kinds of science could clearly be trained to read and process some of these tests and break that logjam. If you think about the kind of production that we are gearing up for this crisis here, which is not over, as Jason said, we're still maintaining a certain death rate and infection rate across the country. The hotspots may be moving slightly from here or there, but nonetheless, if you think about what's going to be needed in Africa, and I'll just give you one example, in Mogadishu, Somalia, they say they have very few deaths from coronavirus. Well, they don't know. They're not able to do any tests. They don't have enough hospitals. But the grave diggers say that they're now burying 3 to 4 times as many people per day as they used to be. So you have a tripling and quadrupling of the death rate in that country. There's no way of verifying that it's coronavirus. So those deaths are not in the figures. But if you think about what this potentially means, well, could we not do a huge mobilization to train also, once we're able to test people and know where this infection is, a lot of younger people can be brought into the workforce and trained to produce the things that are needed. In a sense, you begin to get a leg up on bringing the U.S. economy back to an economy that is based on production as opposed to speculation. This is very, very urgent. The other thing I would say is that in order to do that, we absolutely have to reinstate the Glass-Steagall separation of the banks from commercial banking on the one hand to speculative investment banking, because if we keep bailing out these gambling debts, what you are risking is hyperinflation more than what we've already seen, where everything just goes completely haywire. And we're really going to have to cut it. We're going to have to stop. Lehman Brothers should have been allowed to collapse in 2008. These companies that we've been pouring trillions and trillions of dollars into so they can buy back their own stock, basically, that should never have been done, and we shouldn't be doing it now. And frankly, that same amount of money that we're putting in that could actually help to jumpstart a tremendous infrastructure and industrial recovery in the United States if we would change our policy on that. And again, I would say that the potential for this, Trump being a builder and being interested in doing these things, is one of the reasons why the British launched this witch hunt against him. It's that potential. And it's very, very urgent that the American people demand that that policy be done. So.
Hi. Okay, great. Thank you. So there was a question that came in. The question comes for Bob. It says, are we going to start running out of meat soon? And if so, how long do we think this would take? What could we do to stop this from happening? And also, how can we break up the monopolies?
Well, that's a very good question. And one thing you can do, you can activate the laws that are on the books to break up monopolies. There's one called the Packers and Stockyards Act, which is run through the USDA, and it was specifically established for that purpose, and worked back in the 1920s when the Packers were very large. And it's so that's one thing that could be set in motion. And so what do you end up with? Well, you could end up with lots of smaller packers, but also today in the nation, we have about 1,100 smaller packers. but they can't operate interstate because the law says that they can only function within their own state. And they're very efficient, very good. They get the same inspections as the big guys. Now, in terms of food running out, see, here's what you got to think about. Before the coronavirus hit, the pipeline was full of food, and everything was running. And then coronavirus hit, and all of a sudden there were shortages showing up in everywhere. I mean, you could even in local rural. I know one county in Iowa. It's the largest pork producing county in Iowa in the nation, and they had grocery stores that didn't have any pork in them, and they had thousands and hundreds of thousands of pigs growing around all around them. Now that's the pipeline. And so when the coronavirus first hit, we had shortages, and the pipeline was full because all of a sudden there was a new dynamic. People had to stay home. They weren't eating in restaurants. A lot of the meat was set up to go in big chunks to restaurants and schools and that kind of thing. And so they couldn't retool it. But now you've got a backup because of the coronavirus hitting all these packing plants, and they've shut down. So you've got pork producers killing thousands of hogs. I mean, it's almost unbelievable, and they're burying them, and they've got a big packing plant up in Minnesota that they shut it down, and it won't cut up the meat and sell it, but they reopened it just to euthanize pigs, thousands and thousands and thousands that are going to be hauled to the rendering businesses and destroyed. So how do you rectify this? Well, you got to have some government. We got a government. It's great that Trump activated the Defense Production Act. He said we're going to open up these plants. We're going to put in place what it takes to protect the workers, and that's going to take a lot of doing. But you see, it is significant because it shows that the government can do things, and the government can keep the farmers in business. We shouldn't have one farm foreclosure. I'll give you back in the Depression when FDR took over as president, he got on the radio one day and said, no farm foreclosures. He said if any farmer was getting foreclosed on and they didn't stop it, call the White House. And he set in motion a credit system and refinanced all the farmers in 1 year without computers. So that is the power of government working for the people. Now, many other things were set in place back then when the farm crisis hit. They set up lots of extension agencies in each county. They set up county committees made up of farmers, made up of the local people to maintain and administrate the policies. So it's established that as it's not like it never happened. We have a tradition of doing that, and that's what we should implement.
Great, thank you. So I do want to take this moment to, mention that you do have the ability to unmute yourself to ask a question, and also if you want to be somewhat anonymous, you can definitely send me a private chat like the last person did, or you can use the general chat to ask a question. And if you're having issues with unmuting, just raise your hand. All you need to do for that is to go to where you can see all the participants. listed, and at the bottom you'll see raise hand, and that's where you can raise your hand so that I can help you to unmute. But let's take a moment to see if anybody has a question. And you don't have to be shy. We want to hear from you. Oh, great. Someone unmuted. Hello.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, what's your name?
Wayne.
Hi, Wayne. Glad to hear from you.
Yeah, hi. I have a question and, more or less a statement. So I don't want to go down a rabbit hole or anything, but, and I don't want to sound like I'm touting any kind of conspiracy theory. However, you're discussing, food shortages. You're also mentioning, this monetary policy that's taking that's heading into an effect right now, where they're printing a lot of money and everything of that nature. My first question, though, and then if I may, I'll segue into something that ties right into everything. As far as the virus itself is concerned, I know you spent a lot of time mentioning that China is not responsible for this virus, and I don't know if they are, if they're not, and most of us, we're not sure as well. But then who is? I mean, where did it all come from? I mean, it did take an enormous toll over in China, from what I understand, a lot more than we probably know. And that's my first statement. Okay, where did it all originate from? This whole monetary policy, this printing of money and this bailout scenario that's been going on even prior to this whole scenario, this whole virus scenario. They're printing an enormous amount of money. Where is the bulk of all this money going? And could it be that this hyperinflation that has been described can be part of a policy to more or less crash the economy or the dollar, and to segue us into some kind of a cryptocurrency policy, worldwide. And again, food shortages. Again, I'm not trying to tout any conspiracy theory. Food shortages. It's already been said prior to this virus taking its effect that a lot of people, that are in favor of the Green New Deal, believe that that we should not be, there shouldn't, be cows and I guess all kinds of other livestock or whatever in existence. That's part of their makeup in that respect. So I'm sorry if I sound a little confused, but the last thing I'd like to say and mention is, as far as government stepping in and helping, I mean, they're not even able to manufacture face masks to help people, in the beginning stages. Everything was so screwed up, and it's still screwed up. So I'll just shut up now and listen, see if anybody has anything to say, to address any of what I mentioned.
Good. I think Jason will. I'm going to go first, but I can see, and Bob may also. Actually, I think you're thinking in the right direction, unfortunately, because it is confused. It's a horrible.
Yeah.
It's
unfortunate too.
No, it is very confused, and we're not getting a uniform policy, and it's partly because of the witch hunt against this administration, and it's also because, frankly, I'm not sure how clearly Trump understands the questions of physical economy. He has very good instincts. He has very good instincts against war. He likes building things. He likes manufacturing. But this Wall Street crew is a mess. And unfortunately, thanks to Corona, he's stuck in Washington. He's not able to go out and meet the people and have these big rallies. So he's also probably somewhat at the mercy of whatever these crazy pollsters are saying that people want, which is generally not necessarily what they want. But on this, if you remember, August of 2018, there was a meeting in Jackson, I think it was August, maybe July of 2018. There was a meeting in Jackson Hole of the bankers. And Mark Carney, who was then the head of the Bank of England, but then because Bloomberg ran for president, Mark Carney's term at the Bank of England ended in March, and March of last year, I guess. And then he went on, I think from that, to become the UN climate something or other representative. And what is their mission? It's genocide. It's using the banks to shut down production, to say we're not going to give credit to anything that generates carbon, and the world should actually have about 7 billion people fewer than it does now anyway. So if you feel like there's a conspiracy, there is, and they're not very secret about it. It's right out in the open. So is the financial policy connected to depopulation? Well, I don't know if the bankers all exactly would think of it that way, but it's certainly not helpful to population growth. But the other thing I would just say is I think this crisis, because the end of this system is inevitable, that is, it is just not going to work. They keep needing, it's like someone with a heroin fix. They need more and more and more and more money. And at a certain point, it just isn't going to work. Now, it's up to the policies that we fight for, whether we're going to get a catastrophic collapse or an orderly bankruptcy. That's the difference. But the silver lining in that is because they have lost control, it is the moment in which we really could establish a new system. But to do it requires the major powers. The British Empire, that derivatives bubble.
System?
What?
Well, isn't that exactly what they're trying to do? Is establish a new system by going in this, as you say, negative direction monetarily? I mean, we're inflation. If they can't keep going on like this, where inflation is just going to take full control, and we're going to be like Weimar Germany.
Right, but that is their system. I would say that's.
And what's the policy after that? Cryptocurrency, where where
well, Mark Carney,
to,
yes, I'm glad you brought that up. Mark Carney explicitly did call for a global cryptocurrency. He said we should get out of the dollar, we should have a global cryptocurrency, and it should be based in the Bank of England, of course. So that is what he said. That is what he said.
Now I don't feel like I'm bouncing off the walls here thinking these thoughts.
No, unfortunately, you're right. Jason may want to say more about the origin of this, because I'm sure he has some thoughts on that.
Just a little bit. I mean, we don't really know. Did it come from the wet market in particular? We don't know. Was it somebody who picked it up in a farm somewhere and just happened to go to that market to pick up some groceries? Could be. We do know, based on looking at how the virus has mutated, it doesn't mutate very fast, which is also good news for being immune and for vaccines, I think. But you can sort of trace out, okay, here's how quick this virus mutates, and then here's all the different kinds that we found around the whole world, so we can kind of go back. And they use that to get a sense of when it first made the jump to humans, which they believe is either early December or maybe mid to late November. Now, is it possible that...
When did it hit the United States, by the way? Do you know?
I think our first case was announced in,
They're saying now the first death that they've found was February 6th, because I think they're going back and doing autopsies and finding it, but anyway.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So, but is it possible that there was a leak from a lab? I mean, I can't say for sure it didn't happen. But anybody who is saying that they're very sure it did happen, I think, well, okay, that sounds more like you're trying to create conflict with China than to, figure out how to improve public health in the future. So that's what I'd say. I mean, it doesn't appear to be man-made. People looking at it say, yeah, it looks like, we had the swine flu, we had the avian flu, we had H5N1. There's these things, like, they come from these animal viruses. Sometimes they just change a little bit, and now they can be contagious among human beings. Whereas maybe some of them you can catch it from an animal, but then you can't spread it to another person. So this is one of the things that was unclear in China at first. People were getting sick with it. They said, well, did they get it from other people, or did they get it from some animals that were for sale at this market? It wasn't immediately obvious that you could actually transfer it from person to person. Because anyway, so yeah, that I think that's what I would say about it. I wouldn't believe anybody who says they know it came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and we definitely don't need a war with China.
Well, that's for sure. But isn't it very ironic that these viruses they come about very cyclically? In regards to voting years or election years, I should say.
Well, it's hard to say.
Virus that we hit with. I mean,
Yeah.
there's other viruses that have sort of been, that have taken some kind of effect, over the recent history, as I said, cyclically, along election year lines.
Mhm.
But being that,
Well-
obviously being that Trump is in there and he's the, they're pulling every trick they can to get him out, that, it happened this year the way it did.
And I think that definitely points to, I think that definitely points to China not doing this on purpose, or like creating this or something, because
Well,
I don't think
it also happened that this all sort of took effect, right after we had reached some trade agreements with China, after stringent negotiations that have been occurring for the last several years. So,
and it came at about the worst time it possibly could.
That kind of smells a little fishy. Also, I don't know.
Yeah. I guess there's two things. One is that it hit at like the worst possible time, in the middle of the Spring Festival, when hundreds of millions of Chinese are moving all around, visiting relatives. I mean, what a terrible time to have a disease you're trying to control the spread of, when everyone's traveling more than any other time of the year. On the cyclical nature, given that it's only a few, viruses that we could think of, it's not like, like we have 20 examples we can point to where this happens. I would just be cautious about trying to draw a conclusion when there's only a few cases. So that's all.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I had one more thing I wanted to add. Thanks, Wayne, for those questions. And Bob I'd like Bob to address something we discussed, which is related. LaRouche warned that there would be pandemic diseases. So in a sense, this was knowable, it was foreseeable, because of this question of potential relative population density, which we've discussed frequently. That is, if you have a certain standard of living, certain electricity, running water, and so on, and then you collapse that. So suppose you have a society where you can easily sustain 1,500 people per square mile, and you suddenly don't have electricity, or suddenly your roads break down, and you actually can only sustain 800 people per square mile, and the population happens to be 1,000 per square mile at that time. That is, there's a potential, which is hopefully greater than what you're at. There's the population density that you're at, and then there's a level of collapse. Everyone knows if you lack sleep, you're more susceptible to get sick. If you're malnourished, you're more susceptible to get sick. If you're under a great deal of stress because you've lost your job, you've been foreclosed upon. I forget, we looked at one point the figures of home foreclosures actually shortening life expectancy. I think it's obvious why that would happen. So when you do that, then you are susceptible to diseases, to new diseases, and diseases being able to have a rapid spread. And that's why LaRouche actually warned in the 70s that if we continued to shut down scientific and progress in industry, that we exactly were going to be hit with this kind of thing. So in that sense, it was predictable. Now, Bob told me something which I think is very significant, and I'd like him to just address it on the question of the importing of food, because while we have insanely shut down the family farms here and created these giant monopolies and monopolies of the meat processing and so on, we are also importing food from places where people are starving, like Brazil, and last week we imported our first beef from Namibia. And I think in Namibia, 25% of the children are actually suffering from malnutrition. So think of the insanity of that. But that also creates certain risks of disease, which I think are worth thinking about. And Bob, you might want to indicate some of that, because it also gets at, where do these things come from? How could you suddenly have a collapse of that magnitude?
Yes, that's a very dangerous situation, because what the the cattle producers, they have many meetings and conferences discussing the import of cattle from the standpoint of transmission of disease, and in particular, hoof and mouth disease. And for instance, Brazil and Namibia both have hoof and mouth disease. It's a disease that can live in the soil for years and decades. And they don't have the financial wherewithal to do the testing properly. So there is just tons of livestock in countries all over the world that are not tested properly. Now, just recently, Brazil was allowed by the USDA to bring beef from Brazil into the United States. Soon as they bring it in, and the Brazilian beef company JBS made a big wrote a big article about how they would help supply the United States with Brazilian beef in this shutdown that we're going through, when we raise the most beef in the world in terms of quality. So so you see how this thing is unfolding. So they just brought, like Diane said, from Namibia. Now, what is this high quality beef? No, this is beef that was raised out in the jungles. So if you get hoof and mouth, like into the United States, and it goes through all cloven hoofed wild animals, deer, birds, and you could transmit that in no time. But since most of the cattle, for instance, is raised in these big feedlots, some have, over 1 million head. If you got that in one of those, you would have to shut down the entire lot. You'd have to kill all the livestock, and what they're confronted with is there's the amount of machinery it would take to dispose of that quantity would be almost impossible, because as soon as you had that amount of beef die, if it does, you will have all the animals and birds you can imagine dragging that stuff throughout the whole nation. So that could shut down a whole industry and a food supply. That's an example of this globalization and these cartels and how they operate.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Wayne, for asking your question. Let me see, what does this? Oh, I have another question, no, to comment. Hi, first I would like to thank the panel for the very informative information. My question is, why is per capita the death rate higher in the United States than in China? And again, thank you for your keen insight to what is happening around us today.
So when you say per capita, it depends on which capitas you're talking about. Per capita means head, per person. So if you talk about the death rate, if you look at how many people died out of all the people who live in a country, that's one kind of number. Another number is all the people who died divided by all the people who caught the disease. This would let you know for another person who catches the virus, what is their risk of dying from it. So the United States, the infection fatality rate, the fatality rate per person infected in the U.S., I don't believe is higher than in China. As far as if we look at it compared to the entire population, it's much, much lower in China. Absolutely. I mean, the U.S. surpassed the number of cases in China weeks ago, at least the reported figures from China. And it's, all of these figures should be taken with a grain of salt. But clearly, the kind of intense need for hospitals and overflowing, morgues and all this kind of stuff that was happening in Wuhan at the beginning, that just didn't really happen in a broad way around the rest of the country. They really did an incredible job of they were very strict. They were very strict about this. They shut down the city. You couldn't leave. This isn't like our stay-at-home orders here where they say, please don't go anywhere. But of course, you can still drive anywhere you want to. In China, they were saying, no, the train station, it's shut down. The buses, they're canceled. The airport, it's shut down. Oh, you want to go buy your groceries? Well, you're allowed to go out once every 3 days to buy your groceries. Otherwise, you got to stay home so you don't potentially spread things. One person from the household is going to go buy their groceries. At a certain point, the building managers would basically help bring deliveries to people's apartments, so that people were, ordering their food online, or the government was providing it if people needed the assistance, and then, making sure that everybody was fed. In Wuhan, they really adopted the policy of isolating everybody, and they did a very good job of this quickly. If you get the test and you're positive, you're going to be isolated. If you're sick, you're going to be at a hospital. If you're not that sick, you're going to stay in something like a shelter, where you're with other people who have the disease but aren't feeling that bad, and you can just sort of wait it out, and you've got people you can spend some time with and talk to without worrying that you're going to get them sick, because everyone there is already sick. So because of that, they were able to really slow down the spread, and then also gearing up testing. So it was pretty effective. Some of the things that were done there, we might say, well, gosh, isn't that kind of un-American? Can we do that? I mean, having your phone have a code on it, and if it doesn't have the right code, you can't get in the subway. If they know, oh, you know what, your roommate tested positive, your phone isn't going to give you that code that'll let you, take public transport inside the city, this kind of thing. So they really brought a lot. They brought a lot on it. And pretty successful. And other countries that have taken a similarly very proactive approach have been able to be successful. South Korea, they did a lot of testing, and then a lot of contact tracing. They had they had teams of people that would really do the work of calling people, calling the friends that they saw, or the people that they sat near at church that day, or whatever it was, to call up those people and ask how they're doing and get them tested. And so that worked.
Thank you very much. Is there any other questions? Okay, if there's not, we can go to our closing comments. Please, Jason, would you go first?
You know what? I think I already said enough. I don't want to speak just to say something. So, yeah.
Okay. Bob?
Yeah. Well, one thing I think is important to consider here, since with the food issue, is we got a lot of farmers, a lot of farm organizations that are fighting to produce food. And I think organizations and institutions in the cities should reach out to these farmers and their networks, and both should join hands and push for a policy to in the nation, in the government, that's going to keep all the food producers in business and make sure the food system works properly, and take care of the monopolistic problems.
Thank you. And Diane?
Well, first of all, I'd like to invite everybody watching to a meeting on Saturday of the Schiller Institute, which will be broadcast live on larouchepac.com and schillerinstitute.com, which is a celebration of VE Day on VE Day, May 9th. And it's at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Everybody should join us. And I would say in closing that we should take this victorious spirit. We crushed fascism. We defeated Adolf Hitler in World War II, and we did it with our partners, Russia and China, and the British reluctantly because they had created something they couldn't control. We can take that same spirit now and establish the system that FDR intended, which is an end of colonialism, an end of looting by these big speculators, and relationships among sovereign nations where each nation has the capacity, because they have their own system of national banking, food self-sufficiency, and security, to uphold the principle of the dignity of man. And no one should forget that. So we should leave with a victorious spirit and then take the actions to bring that victory about.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.